Hello everyone, Thomas here from Medieval Review, doing my best impression of a Matt Easton intro. Mostly that's because this is a response video to Matt Easton's recent video on Scholagladiatoria talking about doubling, and that is the what's essentially the effect of two people killing each other at the same time. Realistically, in HEMA or in sword fighting, it means two people striking each other at the same time instead of one person actually properly parrying and riposting or making a valid attack while defending themselves. And that is really a variation that depends, of course, on what sources you're looking at and what type of weapon you're using. And I share in Matt Easton's frustration with this, but Matt, I think there's actually a little bit more that goes into depth with the problem with doubling, as far as I'm concerned, when it comes down to not just determining who's winning or losing or how you should approach a sword fight, but also how you should approach the sources as we study them. And I think there's a really very big negative impact in general that the safety that we afford ourselves in the modern day, wearing all of our safety gear in HEMA, with very little risk, as you said, maybe at worst broken fingers and some bruises, but generally speaking, we're walking away just fine. But it unfortunately has a very negative impact on how we actually begin to train and how we interpret interpret the sources. And so I wanted to speak a little bit to that. Now, doubling as a thing has always frustrated me, and we see this, HEMA in general does a lot to try to highlight doubling and say this is not okay. They do it in tournament rules, etc. And the way I've always put it whenever I'm training people is that there's no such thing in a sword fight as a win-win. The only true win-win in a sword fight is where both people put away their swords, shake hands, and walk away in peace, because once the steel clashes, someone's going to lose. And so a win-win in an actual sword fight, when steel connects to either steel or flesh, there's either going to be a win-lose or a lose-lose. Win-win just really is never an outcome. And what happens in HEMA is we use that win-win scenario a lot when we're practicing. So we'll go into a fight and we'll say, okay, I'm going to do my best to use this certain move. Damn the consequences. And I think that's actually problematic, because the consequences would matter in an actual fight. Now, it's okay to experiment, it's okay to trial, but at some point you actually have to try to understand what it's like to actually be in a fight. Now, of course, this doesn't mean you go out and fight with sharps. I don't really necessarily say that's always the best idea, but in general, you need to kind of have an understanding of how you're actually going to approach a fight if it was a real fight. And I say this is important because when you look at sources, there's a lot of concepts that are very, very grounded in the idea that your opponent is going to have a very natural flinch reaction to a lot of things. And there's a lot of conversations out there in the martial arts community. There's actually a podcast called The Art of Manliness that actually covers this topic at one point, where they talk about converting flinch responses, such as putting your hands up to defend yourself, to convert that into some useful motion. So don't put your hands up to defend yourself, but instead use it to block and attack, right? Dagger fighting is a great example of this, where you have that block and attack mechanism. And it's based on flinch response. But a lot of what at least longsword masters, which is kind of my specialty, what I look into, they really depend on these kind of flinch responses, these reactions to a threat. So a great example would be keeping your sword on center and the point in the person's throat or face area, and so their natural response is going to be to parry that aside. And then you can use that to make a very valid and very good, solid attack at an opening. And good sword fighters will, of course, learn over time that you don't just parry, at least with longsword, don't just parry, but you'll also try to get an attack in there with that parry. But at the end of the day, we don't train that way in HEMA. A lot of times, we don't allow ourselves or afford ourselves the ability to say, what if I was doing this without all the padding on? And what happens is we never train like we would if we were fighting against an actual opponent. We're always training as if we're training against a Superman who's actually impervious to a sword blow. And I think it actually teaches us some bad lessons. We learn some things incorrectly because we're constantly used to fighting someone who's never going to just have that oh crap moment and just swing a sword out to the side to parry an attack, which would be a very valid thing, which would be seen all the time, even amongst good swordsmen. And so it's one of the things that I try to instill in people when I'm teaching them this stuff, that don't be afraid to be afraid a bit, because that's going to help other people learn. And kind of on that subject, because this is a really challenging thing, and Matt actually really talked about it a lot. You're going in, some really good masters going in, they're going to go fight, and here comes the new person. They just kind of swing, and they manage to get that hit, and they manage to actually double on a master because, well, that master did what they were supposed to do, but the other person didn't, right? And this is kind of the other end of the spectrum, where instead of fighting the Superman, you're fighting the absolute novice, and that novice is going to somehow manage to get a hit in. And I've often argued that there's kind of 3 stages to learning a martial art, especially true when it comes to sword fighting, at least longsword in my experience. And that is, there's kind of a beginner, intermediate, and expert level, or master level, to understanding how to use a sword. And one of the best gauges that I think is actually out there to determine whether or not you've graduated from beginner to intermediate, and then from intermediate to expert or master, is beginning to intermediate is I have learned to not just flail wildly, but I'll still lose against a beginner because I'm really focusing on doing what I should do while they are just getting hits in. But a master, that graduation from intermediate to master, is going to, most of the time, if not all the time, know how to react to even the beginner or the intermediate person, and will actually be able to win the fight. And I've talked about it before. I think I talked about it when I was doing a general thought on a book called The Art of Samurai Swordsmanship, or something like that, where they talked a lot about a true master will know how to lose, but do so just barely. Right, so the master will lose to that beginner or intermediate person, but they'll do so in a way that helps that person learn, and that master can teach that way. But they're only a master because they can do that. So kind of rewinding all this back to the concept of doubling, I think that we as a community, general martial arts HEMA community, we need to be better about learning that it's okay to have those fear responses, and maybe even using them as teaching opportunities. Because what we end up doing a lot of times is we double on each other, and we say, oh, we doubled, we shouldn't do that. And then we never really learn anything from it. And both people are being super masters and supermen who are impervious to swords and sword points and cutting edges, and we just go out there and we just let ourselves get hit because no big deal. And so when you look at sources, when you look at how these things should be interpreted or put into practice as we learn these things, we need to take a step back and say, what if I wasn't wearing all this protective gear? What if this was sharp? What if this was a real battle? Would that change how I'd go into a fight? And I think we would actually see this change a lot in things like tournament scenes, where if there was that real risk, people wouldn't go in there. The bouts wouldn't begin in 5 seconds. There'd be a lot of circling, a lot of people really trying to feel out their opponent, because at the end of the day, they've only got one shot at it. And I think we do a halfway decent job in the general HEMA community with our tournaments and all that to kind of instill those things. We'd have points awarded based on whether or not you had control over the fight when you made the point, whether or not it was an open double or a closed double, to determine whether or not anything is valid. But at the end of the day, what we see in tournaments and how people train for tournaments isn't really how they would train for sharp swords. It isn't necessarily the mechanisms or the approaches we would take. And I really think we need to foster that some. We need to think about that some. And Matt, if you're watching this video, it's funny, we had this exact conversation at Long Point. You just didn't happen to be there that day, or you weren't there in that specific room. I think you were probably teaching a class. But we had a lot of these conversations about how do we get ourselves out of being so tournament-minded that we lose sight of the actual martial art, the actual intent to kill that these things were designed for, and understanding how to approach an opponent who may seem like a master because they're impervious, but at the end of the day, they might actually just be intermediate. They might be doing the exact same thing they need to be doing all the time, but they're not afraid of dying, so they're not having those real oh crap moments. And I don't know, it's a real challenge. It's not something that I feel like we should necessarily overcome by, I don't know, using sharps all the time, because I don't think that's actually the answer. There's obviously some validity and some value in that potentially, but with that comes a lot of danger and a lot of responsibility for the people involved. And I think that doubling is something we're going to unfortunately be stuck with for a very long time. But I think we need to stop whenever it happens. If you're ever in a scenario where you have now doubled with someone, think about it. Figure out why it happened. And understand that it more than likely happened because two people are trying to do two things that they wouldn't do if it was a real fight. So just my thoughts on it. Hopefully that adds a little bit to Matt's thoughts, because his thoughts were pretty darn good and I agree with, well, pretty much everything he said. But I figured I would add just that little bit of an extra flavor and context to how I think about it. Hopefully it was useful for everyone else. Have a good day, everyone. See you later. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to my channel. You can also check us out on Patreon and Facebook.